The dawn over the Negev desert does not arrive with a roar, but with a creeping, suffocating silence that feels heavier than the sand itself. On the morning of the assault, the light was grey, filtered through a haze of dust and the false security of high-tech sensors that had for months hummed with the steady pulse of normalcy. In a small apartment in a suburb of Tel Aviv, a man named Eliyahu sat at his kitchen table, staring at a half-empty cup of coffee. He was not a soldier, nor was he a high-ranking official. He was a data analyst for a logistics firm, a man whose life was measured in shipping manifests and port schedules. But Eliyahu had a specific kind of mind, the kind that noticed when a cargo ship from a neutral port changed its speed by half a knot for no apparent reason, or when a specific type of industrial fertilizer began appearing in manifests across 3 different continents simultaneously. He noticed the patterns that others dismissed as the background noise of a globalized world. That morning, as he looked at the news flickering on his silent television, he didn't see the chaos of the border breach. He saw the culmination of a ghost's work. He saw the signature of the invisible planner. The world knows the names of the commanders who lead the charges, the faces of the spokesmen who claim the credit, and the ideologies that fuel the fire. But the Mossad knows that the most dangerous man in the room is the one who never enters it.
For 3 years, a shadow had been moving through the back channels of Tehran, Beirut, and Gaza. This was not a man of speeches or uniforms. He was a master of the mundane, a ghost who understood that the greatest weapon in modern warfare is not a missile, but a logistical oversight. He was the architect of the invisible, the man who could move tons of equipment through a dozen borders without triggering a single red flag. He didn't use encrypted satellites, he used the comment sections of obscure hobbyist forums. He didn't move money through Swiss banks, he moved it through the ancient untraceable networks of trade that predated the concept of a state. The Mossad called him the architect, but to the enemies of Israel, he was simply the ghost. The operation to find him did not begin in a war room with maps and lasers. It began in a dusty basement archive in Nicosia, where a junior intelligence officer noticed a discrepancy in the insurance filings for a fleet of fishing trawlers that hadn't caught a fish in 5 years. These trawlers were registered to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, which was owned by a holding company in Luxembourg, which in turn was managed by a law firm in Panama. On paper, it was a standard tax dodge, but when the Mossad began to pull the thread, they found that these ships were not moving money, they were moving time.
They were positioned in specific corridors of the Mediterranean at specific intervals, creating a moving curtain of physical obstructions that subtly altered the radar signatures of the coast. It was a masterpiece of passive electronic warfare, achieved not with jammers, but with rusted hulls and well-timed mechanical failures. As the investigation deepened, the profile of the planner began to emerge. He was a man of immense patience and terrifying rationality. He understood the Israeli mindset, the reliance on technology, the faith in the physical barrier, the belief that an enemy must eventually show their hand. He played on these certainties like a grand master. He knew that if he moved 1,000 rifles at once, they would be intercepted. But if he moved 1,000 individual firing pins hidden inside a shipment of sewing machines, and 1,000 barrels hidden inside irrigation pipes, and 1,000 stocks disguised as furniture parts, the system would see only commerce. He was building a puzzle across 1,000 miles, and the pieces were being delivered by the very infrastructure Israel relied on for its survival. The tension in the Mossad's inner circle was not the tension of a ticking bomb, but the tension of a tightening noose. Every time they thought they had a lead, it evaporated. A courier would be found dead of natural causes in a hotel in Istanbul. A server in Frankfurt would wipe itself the moment a digital finger touched it.
The planner was always one step ahead, not because he was faster, but because he had started moving years before they knew the race had begun. He was a ghost of the old world, operating in the digital age, with the cold, calculating detachment of a man who viewed human life as a variable in an equation. He didn't care about the glory of the cause. He cared about the perfection of the execution. In the months leading up to the assault, the signs were there, hidden in plain sight. An unusual number of workers in the border agricultural zones had suddenly resigned, replaced by men who were slightly too efficient, slightly too quiet. The power fluctuations in the border fence, usually attributed to birds or weather, began to follow a mathematical sequence, prime numbers that whispered a countdown to anyone who knew how to listen. The Mossad's elite Unit 8200 began to pick up whispers in the static, not words, but the absence of them. In certain sectors of the encrypted web, there was a sudden, unnatural silence. It was the silence of a breath being held before a plunge. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A retired Mossad agent, living out his days in a quiet village in the Galilee, had been obsessed with the history of the 1973 war. He spent his time analyzing the movements of the Egyptian and Syrian forces, looking for the one detail everyone had missed.
One afternoon, while looking at a high-resolution satellite image of a new construction site in Lebanon, he saw it. It wasn't the bunkers or the trenches. It was the way the trucks were parked. They were aligned in a specific configuration used by the Soviet Logistical Corps in the late 60s, a method designed to maximize the speed of a coordinated breakthrough while minimizing the visual footprint of the vehicles. It was an archaic, brilliant technique that had been forgotten by modern military schools. This was the planner's signature. He was a student of history, a man who found his tools in the shadows of the past. The Mossad realized they weren't looking for a tech-savvy youth in a hoodie, but an old wolf who remembered the world before the internet. They began to cross-reference the movement of this specific logistical pattern across the region. They found it in the way a shipment of medical supplies was unloaded in Beirut, in the way a convoy of fuel trucks moved through the Syrian desert, and in the way a small, seemingly insignificant fishing village on the Gazan coast began to expand its pier. The search narrowed to a single individual, a man who theoretically didn't exist. He had no passport, no bank account, and no digital footprint. He was a man who lived in the cracks of the world. The Mossad tracked him to a nondescript villa on the outskirts of Tehran, a place where the air was thick with the scent of jasmine and the distant hum of the city.
But he wasn't there. He was never where he was supposed to be. He was a ghost who moved through the world on the wings of other people's shadows. The investigation turned into a psychological duel. The Mossad team, led by a woman whose family had been lost to a previous shadow of the same conflict, began to map the planner's mind. They studied his preferences, his habits, his small, human weaknesses. They discovered that once a year, on a specific date, he would visit a small Orthodox church in a forgotten corner of the Balkans. He wasn't religious, but he was a man of tradition. He went there to light a candle for a woman who had died 40 years ago, the only person who had ever truly known him. The Mossad didn't set a trap with soldiers. They set a trap with time. They waited. They spent months in that quiet, cold town, blending into the routine of the locals. They became the shopkeepers, the priests, the old men playing chess in the square. They became part of the scenery, invisible to the man who prided himself on invisibility. When he finally arrived, he looked like any other grandfather visiting a grave. He was thin, his hair was white, and his eyes were the color of a winter sea. He moved with a slight limp, a reminder of a long-forgotten skirmish in a war that no one else remembered. He walked into the church, lit his candle, and stood in the flickering light for a long time. He seemed smaller than the legend they had built around him.
He looked like a man who was tired of being a ghost. As he stepped out into the cold afternoon air, he wasn't met with a hail of gunfire or a dramatic arrest. He was met by a man sitting on a bench, feeding the pigeons. The man didn't look up. He simply said a single phrase in a language the planner hadn't heard in decades, a phrase from a childhood spent in a village that had long since been wiped off the map.
The planner stopped. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't try to run. He simply sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 1,000 secrets. He knew the game was over, not because he had been outfought, but because he had been understood. The extraction was silent. Within minutes, the planner was gone, vanished from the street as if he had never been there. The world went on. The pigeons continued to peck at the breadcrumbs. The wind continued to howl through the narrow alleys. In the Mossad safe house, the interrogation was not a battle of wills, but a conversation between two entities that spoke the same dark language. The planner didn't have to be tortured. He was a professional, and he knew that his silence was no longer a commodity. He began to talk, not out of a change of heart, but out of a perverse pride in his own work. He detailed the years of preparation, the subtle manipulations of the global supply chain, the way he had turned the world's bureaucracy into his own private army.
He explained how the assault had been planned not as a single event, but as a series of cascading failures. He had identified the psychological blind spots of the Israeli command, the tendency to over-rely on electronic surveillance, the belief that a wall is an absolute barrier, the assumption that an enemy will always act in their own best interest. He had played on these flaws, creating a narrative of calm that the censors were programmed to believe. He had turned the very tools of the Mossad against them, feeding them the information they wanted to see, until the moment the first bulldozer touched the fence. The information he provided was a map of a hidden world. He revealed the locations of deep cover cells that had been dormant for a decade, waiting for a signal that would never come. He detailed the financial networks that funded the shadows, revealing names that sat in the boardrooms of respected international corporations. He showed how the enemies of Israel had evolved from a ragtag group of militants into a sophisticated global entity that operated with the efficiency of a multinational conglomerate. But as the intelligence officers processed his revelations, they realized the true horror of the planner's legacy. He had built a system that didn't need him. He had created a self-sustaining machine of conflict, a network of autonomous cells and pre-positioned resources that could continue to function long after the architect was gone.
He was the invisible hand, and though the hand had been severed, the fingers were still moving. The assault he had planned was only the beginning, a proof of concept for a new kind of warfare, where the front line is everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The consequences for the network were precise and devastating. In the weeks following the planner's capture, a series of seemingly unrelated events occurred across the globe. A cargo ship in the Indian Ocean suffered a catastrophic engine failure and was boarded by a private security firm that found more than just grain in its hold. A small bank in Beirut suddenly collapsed, its digital assets vanishing overnight. Several high-ranking logistical officers in regional militias disappeared, leaving behind no clues and no successors. It was a silent purge, a surgical strike against the infrastructure of terror, carried out with the same cold rationality that the planner himself had once employed. Yet there was no celebration in the halls of the Mossad. They knew that for every planner they captured, another was being forged in the fires of the next generation. They knew that the invisibility they had fought so hard to pierce was a cloak that could be woven again. The border was rebuilt, the sensors were upgraded, and the patrols were doubled. But the silence of the Negev still felt heavy.
In the end, the story of the invisible planner is not a story of a single man or a single mission. It is a story about the nature of the world we live in, a world where the most significant threats are often the ones we cannot see, where the most dangerous enemies are those who understand us better than we understand ourselves. It is a reminder that intelligence is not just about gathering data, but about understanding the human heart, with all its brilliance and all its darkness. The planner sat in his cell, a man who had reshaped the world through the movement of shadows, and he smiled. He knew that even in captivity, he had changed the rules of the game
forever. The sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long, distorted shadows across the ancient stones of the coast. Somewhere, in a nondescript office in a city that never sleeps, a young analyst is looking at a shipping manifest. They see a minor discrepancy, a small anomaly in the flow of goods that doesn't quite make sense. They hesitate for a moment, their finger hovering over the mouse. Is it just background noise? Is it just a mistake in the paperwork? Or is it the first thread of a new puzzle, the first move of a new ghost waiting in the wings? The world remains a place of hidden layers, a vast and intricate mechanism where every ordinary detail might be a key, and every silence might be a warning. The threat is not gone. It has simply changed its shape, waiting for the next architect to give it form.
In the world of intelligence, there is no final victory, only the constant, unceasing vigilance against the invisible. The shadows are always moving, and the game never truly ends. The light may reveal the surface, but it is in the darkness that the real history of the world is written, one silent operation at a time. The world is still full of invisible threats, and the next one is already hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment the world looks away.